Hello, everyone. Welcome to Cave to the Cross Apologetics. I'm Patrick.
I'm Tony.
We're in kind of the middle of our book here of What About Evil? A Defense of God's Sovereign Glory by Scott Christensen. And we're on chapter 10. Everybody loves a good ending. So if you've made it here and read past it, you might be thinking, wait, what? I thought we were talking about God
evil,
and evil.
Yeah.
This seems like a literature lecture. It will inform, again, we have to understand that Scott Christensen is pretty much starting from scratch with his theodicy. And he's trying to paint, it's like doing a puzzle. You do the edges first. That's what us puzzle amateurs do. You don't turn over the pieces. You find, the colors and you put them together so that way it makes it way easier to do it. I recently did a puzzle, so I'm going to have a lot of puzzle analogies probably. And so he's building his concept of his theodicy, and this portion is a little bit different than what we've talked about. We talked about God's nature and his character. We talked about can evil stick to God? Are we attributing God's actions to evil actions? Why is that not the case, especially from the Reformed standpoint? Now we're kind of developing a more sound entry point into the theodicy aspect to it. So that's where he's coming from here. So he starts off chapter 10 by saying, every child grows up longing for a good yarn, a good tale, a good story. The lure of a fantastic story captivates us from the earliest ages. Gripping plots complete with monsters and mysteries, heroes and villains, set in whimsical landscapes where dangers lurk about, dark forests and magical swords, free fair maidens, or, if you're not a fantasy person, pew-pew lasers, space battles, aliens. Reading to my girls, I'm like, oh, are you here yet? Can I read the story again? Because I want to read it again. The Phantom Toll Booth. I want to read the Hobbit. No, you're bored with it? You cannot be bored with it. It is against family law to be bored with the Phantom Toll Booth. All right, well, we just have to wait a lot longer. But these are not silly flights of fancy, gratuitous forms of escapism. They are otherworldly tales that help children frame this worldly reality as they learn their place in it. And such stories are most certainly not confined to the children.
Right, they're for us as well.
Right.
And so what in the world's going on here with all this story talk, right? I thought, as you mentioned, we're talking about dealing with the problem of evil. Well, he says in order to make sense of God's design for evil in this world, he wants to begin by directing our attention to the realm of story, right? He believes that the answer to the broader question of evil's entrance into God's good creation is embedded in the grand storyline of Scripture, wherein every truth of the Christian faith, including evil, finds its place. So Scripture now is story is how he's going to kind of use that as a placeholder to help him to work through these various issues with the problem of evil. And furthermore, he says the broad themes of the storyline in Scripture in terms of creation, fall, and redemption are surprisingly mirrored, he tells us, in the whole history of storytelling. Right? Go figure, right?
Yeah.
The architectonics, he says, of storytelling demonstrate the universal longing for redemption from the conflict that we call evil. So he's going to talk about here how story and storytelling works within Scripture, the source of it, and how that is going to help him to work through this problem of evil.
Yeah.
Right?
And we've seen this, or you probably maybe know this if you're in the world of Jordan Peterson. He kind of takes this kind of meta-narrative approach and says, what can we draw from Scripture that informs us about humanity? I said this either, depending on where I put the Q&A that we just did, I either said it or will say it, and it's brilliant. You should listen to it, or you should listen to it again because it was brilliant. And so he says, what can we as humans learn from these stories that the human condition is written or understood, or there may be some historical aspects to it, but what's the overall kind of ley lines of a story that we see within the life of Noah or Moses or Abraham or Jesus. If you want a kind of a Christian aspect, there's a podcast by J.D. Wilson called Stories Are Soul Food podcast. And so they do kind of this look at it from a Christian worldview point of view. So I had a lot of fun listening to their stuff as well. And so that's part of what we're incorporating here. But we've also, if you're an expanded reader of C.S. Lewis or Tolkien, if you read The Inklings, which I did a review on last year, which the review can be found on our blog. The Inklings, the group that C.S. Lewis and Tolkien were a part of, they talked about this stuff very highly, and they talked about myths, which we'll get into later, and they didn't shy away from those terms or anything like that, and so they built their stories with kind of this understanding that he's going to go into. So why do we need stories? God has endowed us with a unique gift among his creatures, the gift of language. And the highest art of language is storytelling. Even if you take at this from a secular point of view of molecules demand type idea, this is something that
that's a story.
Yeah, that a lot of them,
I call that a creation myth, right?
These cave drawings that occur that tell about the hunt. These come into play here, and why are we doing that? It's because that's part of our nature is the storytelling language aspect. We're not just communicating, I see a bear over there, but let me tell you about this bear. And the fish story, I caught a fish this big. Well, it was actually this big. If I'm going to be honest, if I'm going to be humble, it was this big. Those are the types of stories that we're talking about too. So the urge to tell stories is clearly one of the distinguishing marks of human existence. We've been doing it for a while. We're still doing it. We're making good money off of it too. Animals communicate instinctively to one another about approaching dangers, about where to find food, water, and other necessities, but they do not regale their companions with tall tales of the grand hunt or romantic rendezvous in the forest. But for humans, stories are primal. And this isn't just books, this is movies, this is radio dramas for those that remember radio dramas, and all sorts of things that are occurring where we're telling stories, and they don't have to be all fiction, where we're kind of, when you listen to a true crime podcast or a true crime story, you get here are the players, here's the rising action, the murder happens, and now another storyline breaks off of that, and now you're on the case. Yeah. And did the person do it? Did they not? I think someone was set up here. The cops are bad, but then the bad guy is bad, but maybe not. Oh, here's the confession and the decline in action and the conclusion. That's the story we put even into the a murder occurred today. It was very sad. They were survived by this person. This person was put on trial. No, the story that we tell within the confines, even in a court case, a good lawyer says, tell a story. You're telling a story to people. Yeah. That's how the prosecutors, the defense attorneys connect with the jury. They tell stories. Yeah, that's exactly what lawyers say. Yeah.
And so Christensen asked the question, why are we captivated by stories? Why do we need them? And he says, the reason is to make sense of our place in the world. We automatically assemble our fragmented experiences, he tells us, together in kind of a sensible and satisfying narrative, right? We have a propensity for framing a constellation of the most important, exciting, and even disturbing threads of our lives, each converging and ebbing, he tells us, and flowing to a clear destination, right? And attended with various successes and hardships. We just, that's the way we're made. Mm-hmm. We're framed that way. Right.
Yeah. Yeah. I was just reading kind of a collection of 10 stories for young adult readers, and it's 15 pages, and it's these kind of famous people within history, and they start out with childhood, they go into teenage years, they go to kind of what they're famous for, and then they died. Okay, that's kind of a boring story, but within 15 pages, they talk about, in childhood, this tragedy informed what they would do. Here's something that they saw or learned about or experienced that informed what they would do. Here's something within what they were doing, that they look back upon their childhood and said, I was like this person who's coming to me saying, why does this peanut grow really, really good? Or, what do we see out in nature that you're able to deal with these very sick people, and you saw it happen worse, and you developed tools to treat it better. Within 15 pages, it's wow. This rising action conclusion that's really, really neat to see. So, however, our personal stories achieve a deeper significance only when they fit within the grander communal story. We need to fit into a narrative that is larger than ourselves, or we lose sight of who we are as individuals and as a collective community. Flannery O'Connor writes, a people is known not by its statements or its statistics, but by the stories it tells. Mm-hmm. And this, think about, if you're American, think about all the stories that you know about the American Revolution. Are those on this and this date, George Washington crossed the Potomac? No. The Hessians were on the other side, and this dangerous swirl well was around them, and they snuck over, and they had to take these people out, or they were cut off, and they were going to die. And that's what won the Revolution. Well, except for all the other battles, and Washington actually retreated more than he succeeded in battles, and there was a lot of desertion. Okay, but those stories are the ones that stick with us. Ben Franklin and his kite flying in the storm. Did that happen? Yeah, probably not. But it informs our idea of the inventor that Ben Franklin was. It talks about his adventurous activity where he's going to fly a kite in the storm and all these things. So this kind of a broader storytelling is the backbone of civilization, says Brian Gadwa. It has maintained ritual, systematized beliefs, and taught dogma. In essence, story intricates the myth and values of a culture with the intent of perpetuating them. That's the goal of them, is to, I'm telling the story and it's going to do something.
So it brings cohesion, it brings order to a particular culture or society. It allows that culture or society to pass on the various things that it holds as truth and as what's important, and to the next generation. Mm-hmm.
Right? One of the biggest money collectors during World War II was after the Battle of Iwo Jima. They got the flag raisers that were still alive for that famous flag raising of Iwo Jima, and they had them go on a press junket tour to talk about here's the island hopping we did. Here's the great battles that we fought, and here Iwo Jima had the highest number of Medal of Honor winners in a single battle, and they used that story, that picture, to then raise money in that way. That was actually the second flag raising. That was done at the spur of a moment. The photographer barely had the camera up to it. It was just a great shot that was immortalized, and they took that story and utilized it to talk about battle and humanized the war that was over there that people were experiencing kind of for the first time within the movies and stuff like that. So storytelling, even in war, is this thing that can be utilized within what we're talking about here.
Yeah. And so let's he narrows in here in this issue of myth and myth making, and he says the sort of myth that Gadwa, which is this guy that he's quoting here and helping us to understand, is talking about is not the popular perception whereby people maintain confident and persistent beliefs in a distorted reality. That's what we usually think of when we think of myth, right? Yeah. An outright fabrication, a pernicious falsehood, he tells us, right?
Perseus cuts down Medusa's head after reflecting her vision in the shield.
Right. Yeah. So he says, no, a myth here is a storytelling impulse that we lean on to frame the identity of the community of the people that we belong to. Myths, he says, are worldviews constructed through stories, completed with rituals and corporate identity markers, values, and ethics, as well as familiar heroes and the villains that the heroes have conquered to achieve the goals necessary to forge human meaning and purpose. Mm-hmm. So that's what he's talking about by myth here, right? Not a tall tale kind of myth, but the kind of worldview constructed stories that are, that can be true.
Right. Myth tells us a society what is important. They provide explanations for the origins and destiny of a people and the world they dwell in as they perceive it. Go back to history. Why was sometimes history class so boring? Well, because you have to memorize the dates and stuff like that. But then you get to the Battle of Gettysburg and you talk about, the Sherman's charge and how spectacular that. Now let's go back to the number of dead and what happened, and then let's go to the gal that's overlooking the battlefield and just the slaughter happening, and then let's go back and talk about where the troops split up from there and how it rerouted Lee's army. But you kind of remember those things, and you create movies based on the Gettysburg, not for the date. I mean, you do have those things. You Ken Burns' documentary is super important within the confines of documentary. But that's kind of the exception that proves the rule here. But, if you watch the movie Gettysburg, that's a great movie. That's a great myth. The myths that people construct tell them who they are, where they came from, where they're going, and why they exist. The Star-Spangled Banner. It was a battle. Why is that part of our thing that we say at every hockey game, at every football game? Why is that, the thing that inspires people to stand up and put their hand over their heart? This is one of those myths that within the confines of what we're talking about here is something that is building up the nation. That's one of the reasons it was brought out. History tells us that all humans are myth makers. No society has survived long without the creation of myths. We are meaning seekers. We're seeking meaning through stories, historical narratives, legends, and grand epics.
Yeah. Good. And so he says, not every myth that people devise obviously is true. Right? The story myths that we construct are often full of myths of the other type, right? Untruths, fictitious kinds of narratives, and that sort of thing. Nonetheless, everyone situates his or her life within some kind of myth, he tells us, whether true or false, historical or fictitious, and sometimes a stew of both true and false types of claims, right? But he quotes C.S. Lewis here, says that there's really only one true myth, right? And that, of course, is the verdile story given to us by the triune God of Scripture. Right. That's the only true myth. So every other story, to a certain extent, has some, is off the rails slightly, in terms of truth, right? Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So we're talking about this within the confines of a worldview, right? We're saying what worldview accounts for this universal human condition to tell stories. The Christian worldview obviously is going to draw from Christianity and say the redemptive history of Christianity is the foil in which all other aspects of storytelling are derived from. So this three-part action with the man against man against nature, man against himself, the protagonist, antagonist, the rising action, all these things, they find themselves in the image of the Christian worldview here.
Right.
So life in literature, the essence of an epic historical event does not have to sacrifice what is true. It does not have to do that. A myth can be true. It simply needs to carefully distill the essence of the event so that it reflects the powerful shared experience of our lives. Many more of these things Jesus did, but if I took the time to write more about them, they would fill the pages of the earth. Okay, so you're telling me John made decisions? He left things out? There's stories out there of Jesus doing things and saying things that we're not aware of? Yes. Here's the myth of the Gospel of John. According to Leland Riker, if we can see our own experience in the characters and events of history, it has captured something universal about life. History tells us what happened, while literature tells us what happens. And so, again... the idea here is kind of seeing ourselves in the deal, right? Yeah. And so that we can identify with it, right? Yeah. Thus, a good history is crafted with the art of good literature. It is why the historical narratives of the Bible are deeply personal and told with literary genius.
Yeah, Good. And so storytelling, he tells us, has the capacity to unearth truth in sundry regions where the most articulate propositions might flounder, right? So a story, we can put together truth in a certain way, he's suggesting here, that if we just say the truth and tell it, may not work, right? People may not get it. They may not identify with it. But with a story, he says, it's a different thing. He says the art of literature appeals to our understanding through our imagination. And if we recognize and feel the, for instance, horror of Cain's behavior, let's say in the story of Cain and Abel, then we've grasped the truth of that particular story. Right.
So how many people have read Plato and Socrates and Aristotle? Now, how many people have seen and written on The Matrix? And how much has The Matrix so much so that they made a fourth movie for who knows what reasons other than money. For 25 years, that movie has been lightning in the bottle, a staple that you couldn't reproduce. That, I think most people even admit the first one is phenomenal. The next two are fine, depending on where you fall, or they're terrible. I think they're fine. But the Matrix hits on so many things that you could pull out anything from that, from any perspective. Because why? Because they hit on that storytelling aspect, that
it's a
the human condition
told story.
Yeah. It's good. It was just nice to watch The Matrix again, to think about The Matrix. So storytelling invigorates our virtues as it equally exposes our vices. It concretizes the abstract and injects knowledge deeper into our mental awareness.
Right, so it makes it concrete, right? It makes it stable, right? It establishes it as the idea here, right?
Yeah. The narrative thread woven through the Bible in itself is the paradigm of visceral storytelling as truth. Its power lies in the uncanny ability to diagnose the inner character of the human life and history via a divinely infallible microscope, Hebrews 4:12 says.
Yeah. So that's what the scripture does for us, right? So now what he's going to do here is to talk about this whole idea of what he calls the monomyth, right? The emerging monomyth, right?
That's the big black block in 2001: A Space Odyssey, right?
So he says, ever since Aristotle, perhaps the world's first literary critic, right? Okay, Aristotle. Careful analysis of storytelling has revealed certain universal, he says, commonalities. Every well-crafted story devises a poignant conflict that piques the audience's interest, which then demands resolution in the unfolding of the plot, right? So he says the form that such storytelling takes is called the monomyth, or the one story, right? It's a compelling narrative, and it needs a compelling crisis, right? A ruinous set of circumstances that cry out for resolution. So that's the monolithic type, or monomythic, rather, type of issue with regard to stories, right?
Yeah, and you see in the 60s and 70s, you had these movies come out that were kind of countercultural, and they tried to deconstruct this type of storytelling. They were, Francis Schaeffer talks about this too, where these people come along and they're doing interpretive dance, and they're talking about the color purple for 60 minutes, or you're only looking at a blue screen, or something along those lines, but even there, it as different because you're informed by this monomyth type storytelling. They're deconstructing it, which means they're using it to say, look how different I am. Right. Look how different this is. Right. This doesn't have characters in a play, in the confines of a setting with conflict and resolution. Right, but by you pointing that out, or by you doing that, you are actually referring to it, and
you're telling your own story.
Yeah. There's that aspect of the artist can't devolve himself out of the art, no matter how much postmodernism tries to do that. So the ideal plot is a U-shaped. So the letter U, not the us royal U.
So it goes like this, is what he's suggesting, right?
Good.
Or does it go like this?
Yeah, upside down U?
Yeah.
More like that.
I think that's what he's getting
It's the bell curve.
Yeah.
Good is followed by the descending darkness of catastrophe, and then followed by the ascending restoration of good again in some way. The stories that leave the most lasting impression are the ones in which the darkest hour is just before the dawn.
Right. So maybe it is this kind of you. We start off with good, and then we descend into darkness, and then we finally end up.
Yeah. So it
and
depends
they lived happily ever after.
Yeah, on your characters. Yeah. The dress is torn, glass slippers. Yeah.
Yeah.
Some of the best stories do not end well, but in either case, they highlight our insatiable need for good endings. How many times have you read a story and then the happily ever after happens, and then everyone died, the world exploded, and you're like, well, that's just unsatisfying. I just wasted however the short story or.
And he's going to deal with these tragedies, right?
Yeah,
is what they're called.
Yeah,
right?
Not everything needs to be, and they lived happily ever after.
Right.
The story formula is key there.
Yeah, exactly. And so he says, obviously we don't like plots with flat lines, right?
There's a guy and nothing happened.
Yeah.
Okay.
They need to be
brilliant.
Right. There need to be some indomitable conflicts, he tells us, and there need to be some what he calls catastrophic types of situations. So catastrophic is kind of the word for a good catastrophe, right? That's the prefix there has to do with good, right? Like eulogy is a good word, right? So catastrophic is a good catastrophe. That's what he says is needed in a good story. He says, although specific storylines differ, whether composed as comedies, tragedies, romance, satire, epics, or whatever, the overall arc of the plot undergirds a native impulse, he tells us, to contrast good and evil, success and failure, prosperity and adversity in such a way that what is perceived to be good and right and true should triumph, right? If not the resolution of the story itself, then at least in the minds of the audience, right?
Yeah. Braveheart. Braveheart loses in the end. It's a terrible story. Everyone remembers Braveheart.
Oh, yeah.
This unifying universal storyline is found not only in the long history of literature, but more recently in our present filmmaking and television era. The most basic forms that this monomyth takes are tragedies and comedies. So here's the two faces of the frowny face and the silly face. According to the great medieval poet Dante, a tragedy is a story that begins with joy and ends in pain. Right. Comedy begins in pain and ends with joy. Our souls long for good outcome of a comedy, and we dread the painful outcome of a tragedy.
Yeah. So those are the two basic kinds. Right?
Hamlet, everyone dies, but it's fulfilling.
Yeah, it's a tragedy, but
here's what revenge gets you: utter death and destruction.
Exactly, right? So he says even in tragedies, we're encouraged to long even more for the ending of a comedy, right? It's important to note that tragedy is not a celebration of evil's triumphs. Right? Few stories, he says, consciously seek to celebrate what is perceived as evil, even if they do so unwittingly or with a consciously distorted ethics, right? Instead, he tells us that tragedy produces grieving over the good that ought to have triumphed. Yet it fell short because of the story's flawed tragic heroes who were overcome by their flaws or the crisis they face, right? So that's what a good tragedy does. It allows for our longing for the good, right? Mm-hmm. He says the history of the monomyth tells us that we need both the tragedy and the comedy. Life does not always end well, but this creates greater longing for how life ought to end, right? So that's what a good tragedy does for us.
Well, and I think we'll stop here before we get into the monomyth within the confines of what we're talking about. And so hold on. Again, this is to inform our theodicy and understanding this. Again, we're still talking about very important things, especially within the Christian worldview. We're explaining where these storytelling, these myths come from, why they resonate so well. Was it just our shared physiology and all the different pop bottles shaken up there and they're fizzing at different rates when we hear a really
physiology
good...
Yeah. It's when you shake a pop bottle,
right?
That makes sense to me, yeah.
If other people, if Socrates can make up words, I can make up words.
I think that's physiology.
Yeah. Physiology. So join us next time as we complete chapter 10 here, where we figure out, does everyone love a good ending? What is our good ending?
Yeah.
So thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
We'll see you next time.